in order for me to cross, the Pacific Ocean, I need two tankers, and I'm taking about 110,000 pounds of gas a tank. Now, what if I just need one tanker and then multiply that across the entire fleet? So it adds up.
All players, low down, active, bullseye 1327. So tactical.
Lights on.
All right, we're live. Welcome to The Merge, where we make sense of defense in an enjoyable way. I'm your host, Mike Benitez, callsign Paco. Today, we're going to dive deep into something I actually been on my list for a while. One of the most iconic aircraft in military history, the B-52 Stratofortress. First flown in 1952, it's been pretty much the cornerstone of U.S. air power since the founding of the United States Air Force, and it's not done. So there's a lot of things going to keep it relevant, roughly for about 100 years of service, so into the 2050s, and that's what we're going to dig into today. So to do that, I phoned a friend and someone who has a B-52 operational background, a weapons school graduate, a commander of a B-52 test squadron, and now currently the commander of AFOTEC Detachment 5, the unit that is not only overseeing the B-52 modernization program, but about 20 other programs in bombers and tankers, ISR, special operations, and other stuff today. That is a lot to get through. Today we're focused on the B-52, the mighty BUFF, and to do that we have Colonel Joe Little. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paco. Appreciate it.
How was that intro? Is that a decent intro?
That is a very decent intro.
Can we call you Little Joe?
Yeah,
Joe, Little Joe? All right.
Little Joe's
fine. Little Joe and I go back, I don't know, 6 years, something like that.
Yeah, since 53rd Wing.
Yeah, you're doing bomber tests, I was doing fighter tests, and yeah, we sat next to each other for a while. So, all right, what am I missing? Fill in the missing pieces in your background, and then we'll jump into the BUFF.
Yeah, you bet. Like Paco said, Little Joe, I was flying the B-52 for over 20 years. I've got 3,000 hours in this historic aircraft. Kind of did the standard B-52 crew tour, if you will, at Barksdale and Minot. Even did some time in the Pacific as permanent party in Guam. So that was kind of my intro to the Indo-PACOM theater to see how that aircraft was going to be integrated into a lot of the O plans there. I then did a staff tour at U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM. Then I got to see the other side of the nuclear planning aspect of that, which obviously the B-52 being a dual docked or dual capable mission with both conventional and nuclear. And that is when I started my quest and test, if you will, as Paco said, commander of the 49th Test and Evaluation Squadron, and then stayed with the 53rd Wing before getting this great opportunity at Det 5.
So just going back for just a little bit, so you've been flying the BUFF for about 20 years. What did it look like when you first started flying? Because I imagine like especially the last 5 years, and especially the next 5 years, are going to be crazy. But for the first, probably most of your career, it was relatively normal, like as far as like sustainment and upgrades and things like that, right?
So first coming into the B-52, I was one of the first classes out of navigator training back when it was at Randolph. It transitioned from the strike course that was at Pensacola. That was a joint Navy program that really focused on B-1s and Strike Eagles. It was doing B-52s, and then it kicked it over to Randolph, which really concentrated on old school heavy navigation. And first coming to the B-52 has resonated a lot with that type of training. So you get in the cockpit, and it's just like you think of kind of from pseudo Dr. Strangelove. The pilots had very low SA in terms of situational awareness tools. They just had a little TV monitor that was an old school low-level TV camera and an infrared camera. That was the only thing it served. And it was really on the team below with literally a paper chart and a pair of dividers down there plotting out as we went along in terms of navigation. And then the weapon system itself was still running off of these cartridges that were about the size of a brick and weighed about the same. Old magnetic tape cartridges that took minutes and minutes to reload or even load a mission. And then fast forward now to today, where now we have an organic color display. The entire crew can now target directly into the operational flight system. They can navigate via the flight system, and they have a moving map up the entire time. So the roles of the crew members have shifted dynamically. When I first got there, it was still very much oriented in the strategic air command way. Is you are the navigator, you are the radar navigator, or which is, better known as a bombardier. And then you did your job, and there was no kind of crossing or intermingling amongst them. And now the entire crew is integrated. The CRM is completely different from what it used to be. And in fact, the terms themselves, we're not even talking about radar navigator or navigator anymore. You now have your modern day weapon systems officers.
I was always a fan of the bombardier wings, so I really wanted to bring those back. Those are probably the coolest set of wings that we don't use them anymore. But man, cool
definitely warm on Fridays.
I never even thought of that. The whole time I was at Wiz, I didn't even think about the bomb wings. Like,
we sported them.
Oh man, look at that! I never knew that. That's awesome. Let's go back just a little bit. The B-52H is the current version that's flying. That version, the H model, has been basically in service for most of the B-52's life, right?
It has. The tails that we're flying now are all from 1960 and 1961.
Man, that's crazy.
Yeah. So here's an interesting fact, though. In terms of age, they're the oldest. And people look back and they're like, oh, well, that was during Vietnam. Aren't they beat up? Well, during the time of Vietnam, you still had the D and the G model, which were the predominant models. There were Fs and Js, but those were the ones that were really flying combat in Vietnam. And even the G model in Desert Storm, even though the H flew a lot too, but during the Vietnam conflict and during most of the Cold War, because the H was the new bomber, they were the ones that were actually sitting alert at most of the SAC bases. And at the time, Strategic Air Command decided to retain back in the United States to fulfill the nuclear mission. And that's back when we were doing, 24/7 alert.
I didn't actually consider that. That is a great point. So from when the B-52 was overall around 750 B-52s were built in a period of just like 10 years, which is crazy. And yeah, so we have about 105 or so, 100 flying around right now.
There's actually about 76 now. So it's
that's
less
right.
It's less than 100 based on the latest drawdown.
I guess there's 76 and about, I think 20 or 30 of them are demodded for the nuclear. They're just conventional only, but there's kind of all spread around. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to dust off some cobwebs here. Well, so speaking of cobwebs, and I'm glad you brought up Vietnam. That's really where the nickname came from, the BUFF, right? And from Vietnam, it was Arclight missions that painted them in the funny camouflage that started throwing stuff all over the bombers, right?
Yep. You got the big, ugly, fat fellow. We'll say for the podcast.
It's okay. It's okay. We'll bleep it out. You can just say but that's okay. I can do it. Yeah. You don't want to do that. All right. I got you. I'd have the F-bomb from the BUFF.
Yep.
And it's funny, we were just talking about paint and camouflage. Just as we're recording this, maybe a couple days ago, they had the orange painted B-52 coming out of, I think it was just phase, or coming out of mod or phase.
Coming out of depot out of Tinker to go to Barksdale, and that will be the new 49th TES's flagship.
Yeah. I noticed it was the 49th going to Barksdale, which was your former squadron commander, right?
That was my squadron. So that is a heritage paint scheme of the B-52B that was out here at Edwards, where I'm currently assigned.
Nice.
Yeah.
Now, is there any correlation? Because it looks like maybe the shade of that orange corresponds with the orange of the 49th, or is it just kind of coincidence? That's the color of the 49th, right?
So it all kind of rotates around that test orange.
Okay. All right. We'll call it a remarkable coincidence that someone painted the 49th bird in the 49th color.
They worked that pretty diligently over the last couple of years. So that was intentional. It's kind of cool that it actually happened and it came through. So obviously being a former commander of that unit, it's pretty cool that it got there.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I was like, man, you and I, we talked about doing this episode. I had no idea that was going on, and then that kind of hit. So that's.
So I heard the rumors, and I'm like, okay, and then it popped, and the funny thing is I've already gotten calls from the Edwards Air Force Base here going like, hey, like we're interested in doing that too. So
There you go.
back to Test Fleet Orange.
That's actually the perfect segue because we're going to talk about test. That's really what we want to talk about today. So you started in the 49th, which is a test and evaluation squadron. That's operational test. You are now a commander of AFOTEC, which is the Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center, Detachment 5. They both say test. They both say operational test. They're not the same things though, right?
They're not. So we're going to talk about the difference between kind of big OT, which is what I would say AFOTEC does, and then MAGCOM OT, which is the mission of the 53rd Wing and units like the 49th TES. AFOTEC is the Air Force's Operational Test Agency, OTA, and that's actually a formal Title 10 congressionally mandated based on some lessons learned in Vietnam. So we talked about the Vietnam War a little bit, but AFOTEC kind of goes back to that and back to kind of your Strike Wizzo heritage as well, Paco. When the Air Force fielded things like the F-111 and the F-105 and did not have anything that looked like operational test. And as a result, when they pushed this thing through developmental test and sent it right into combat, there were failures and mishaps that resulted a lot with those two aircraft in particular that resulted in fatalities and downed aircraft that had nothing to do with enemy fire. So formal operational test was birthed from that. It's congressionally mandated and is a formal part in an acquisition cycle when we're bringing on major acquisition programs. We call them ACAP 1. So those are programs that are in excess of $1 billion that are under congressional oversight because Congress wants to know where, if you're spending over $1 billion of taxpayer money, where's that going and how is it being utilized?
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, it seems like a good idea. So then we have initial operational test and evaluation. That hits the news a lot because it's supposed to be kind of the final checkout for some airframes and you're not supposed to really hit any hiccups. But what you find out is things that work well in developmental tests in a very scripted environment, when you put it in an operational either environment or configuration, things change and there happens to be discovery. We don't really look at tactics development. We let the 53rd Wing and other agencies that do MAGCOM OT handle that because that's a MAGCOM problem to solve. And then other things like lower echelon acquisition projects such as ACAT 3 typically fall right to the MAGCOM. They don't go through AFOTEC or oversight. So that's where those entities take that and we focus more on the formal piece of it and the larger acquisition projects.
Speaking of larger acquisition projects, which is why you're on the show, the B-52, so you're managing, obviously you have a whole fleet that we talked about earlier as the commander, but just for the B-52 portfolio, you don't have just one massive upgrade or two. You're managing 3 and arguably 4 concurrent upgrades that are each individually just these crazy large problem sets, and you threw them all together into one big pot. That has to be a wicked problem to solve. So let's talk about what the Air Force is doing and really the United States to invest in B-52 modernization. How is the B-52 going to stay relevant into its 100th anniversary?
It's crazy, and at the same time, it's exciting too. I've kind of blabbed on about, the last 20 years of me being the B-52. And during that time frame, though, it was all just sustaining the current platform as it was. We did a couple cool things, like we added an advanced targeting pod, and we updated the OFP to some more modern equipment. That was all operational test, right? These are like little things that we can put on the aircraft relatively easy. Well, now we're going to completely modernize this aircraft so much that it's actually going to get a new designation, and it's going to move from the B-52H to the B-52J. Right now, in my detachment specifically, I have 3 major programs, and then my cohort, Detachment 2, they handle Air Force major acquisition weapons programs. They have the long-range standoff missile, or LRSO, which is another major acquisition. But it's still a dance because there's 4 major acquisition programs that are all getting pushed down the path together, and then all of them require substantial test and operational test. And how do we do that? So Detachment 5 specifically has 3 of those major acquisition programs, one being the radar modernization program, which is going to be the APG-79 V4. We can get into that in a little bit. We have the commercial engine replacement program, or CERP. Those are going to be replacing the 8 TF-33s with 8 commercial off-the-shelf engines. And then we have AEHF, which is the Advanced Extremely High Frequency Radio that has to deal with NC3, Nuclear Command and Control. That's a larger program, but the B-52 is definitely the threshold as far as the Air Force goes in receiving nuclear emergency action messages.
Okay, let's talk about the radar, since that's the first thing you brought up. I'm familiar with the UPG-79 product line. So that's the Super Hornet radar, the ESA radar. There's different versions of it. There's the V1 is what you see in the F-18EF and then the E-18 Growler. And then you have the V4. And the V4 was basically a subscale version using a smaller array to fit into a legacy Hornet for the Marine Corps. Is that the version that you guys are using, the Marine Corps version?
So ours is even more of a Frankenstein. It's a 79 V4 dish on the front. And then we have an APG-82 processor in the back. So what you were used to in the Strike Eagle, but because it's a B-52, there's a lot more that has to go into. We had to come up with a liquid-cooled system to cool the processor, since we don't quite get the ram air that a fighter would get. There was some development with that, and it had to be nuclear hardened, which is the other big factor for that radar.
How do you nuclear harden an ESA radar?
So that all just goes into EMP hardening.
Okay.
I'm just a wizzo, so I don't know the science behind that. But literally, the whole reason we had to do that was for the nuclear mission, because we had this old APQ-68. Think of, your green 360-degree sweeping ground mapping radar that looks like something you see out of, the movie Airplane. That was it. And what a leap forward that we're going from that MEXSCAN radar to an ESA, just because that's what's available in the modern age. We can't buy MEXSCAN radars anymore. But in order for us to stay relevant and to take off in a nuclear environment and be able to airline and come up with a navigation solution without GPS, you need a radar to do that.
In the news, I've heard it written down as V4, like Victor, and B4, Bravo. Is it the V as in Victor 4 version, or is it a special like Bravo version designation?
Everything I've seen is V4.
Okay, so myth is busted.
Okay.
The other myth I heard is that the antenna is installed upside down in the B-52. Is that a myth?
Ooh, honestly, I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I do know that if you take off the radome of the BUFF, they put in some support bars up top to put this old antiquated ECM equipment. And there was big discussion about taking all that equipment off. And of course, these requirements were made, 5 or 6 years ago. And you said, absolutely not. You can't remove the ECM equipment because that's what's going to preserve the life of the B-52 and keep it survivable. So think of the equipment's up here. So they had to mount the ESA radar down here. So the lookup on it is restricted. And then come to find out is they ended up deactivating all of this equipment anyway, just because the threat has modernized. So this ECM equipment is no longer valid.
Oh man.
So we probably could have just chopped that out to begin with. But the acquisition cycle being what it is and where you're at for development, like you can't go back and rewind time as much as people want to. And they're like, oh, that would be so great if we could. But cost comes into play here. You know, everybody's like, oh, why can't we just rip this thing off and we'll just slap the dish on the bulkhead and we'll just run with it? Well, that would probably overrun the cost of the program and get the program canceled.
Yeah, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, we don't want to. We'll stick with that guy.
All right, so myth is maybe not musted. It could be upside down, maybe not.
Maybe
Doesn't
not.
matter.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Good one. You have a chance to fly it yet, or is it still in DT?
No, so it's actually not even in DT yet. It's still finishing up modification at San Antonio at the Boeing facility there. So I've got to see the work that they're doing. It should be here at Edwards May or June of 25. And then we've got to wait on some software. Boeing's developing the software to actually run it. So hopefully we can get that sooner rather than later so that we've got a jet, but we can't fly it or start test until that comes online.
You mentioned earlier with the old school, you had your nav, your charts, your plotters, and your old E-scope or E-scope, whatever you call it now. Now you have a ESA radar. I would imagine like there's a crew, an extra person, maybe doesn't need to be there anymore, right? I've heard a lot of stories about this quad crew concept.
Yeah. So even before that, with the older G's and H's, you had a 6-person crew. So you had 2 pilots, 2 navigators, an electronic warfare officer, and an enlisted gunner.
Oh, I forgot about the tail gunner. Oh man, I completely forgot about that guy.
So right after Desert Storm, with the big reduction in force, no more enlisted gunners, get out of here. They took all the tail guns out of the B-52. So we were left with a 5-officer crew. And for those of you that don't know, yes, there's an upstairs and a downstairs to the B-52. So the 2 pilots sit where normally pilots sit. And then aft of them, sitting backwards, is the electronic warfare officer that is handling all the defense of the aircraft. And then kind of downstairs, if you will, on the lower deck, sitting forward, are 2 navigators or WIZOs, as we call them now. The jet was invented before the term, I think, ergonomics even existed. And I kind of told you about just how the crew duties were broken up. Well, with advances in the flight software, and when we bring on this new radar, this new capability, and the aircraft system can do more, and we actually have a true WIZO now. The electronic defense equipment that is upstairs with the RMP is going to move downstairs and be combined with the 2 navigators or the WIZOs that are down there to be a true 4-person crew. Think of it as kind of like a B-1, but the offensive systems officer and the defensive system officer just swapped.
Real quick, B-52 tail gunner. So Fox 4. I still remember that trivia. A Fox 4 is a tail gunner kill.
It is.
And the B-52 does have a MiG kill in the Vietnam War from the tail gunner. There is a Fox 4 kill.
That tail is the one that's actually at the Air Force Academy.
Really?
Yeah,
man.
That is the jet that is at the Air Force Academy.
Does it have a star painted on it? And if so, is it at the tail?
I'm almost positive it does.
That's awesome. I didn't even know about that.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
They had to shave some of the wing length off because winds got severe enough at Colorado that they were beginning to take flight.
Oh, man.
Because you only need about 50 or 60 knots, get the wingtips to kind of start lifting.
Holy crap. That's crazy.
Yeah.
The thing loves to fly. All right, let's talk about let's talk about engines. You said the SERP, the commercial engine replacement. When I think of a commercial engine, the B-52's got 8 engines, and probably a symptom of the time of when it was created in the engine technology back in the day. They were turbojets, right?
Yeah, turbojets in the G model, and they went to turbofans with the H model.
Gotcha. Okay. So we have these 8 smaller pods, 4 pods, 2 engines each, 8 engines. For those of you who have never seen a B-52, when I think commercial engine replacement, I think something like a 747 will have 4 pylons, 4 big engines, but that's not what the concept art looks like. So walk us through that.
No, so this has been proposed, probably 2 or 3 times since I've been a B-52 crew member is re-engineering this. And so the 4-engine concept was explored, but this is before regional jets really, started making a lot of money for the airlines, and they became really productive and economical. So the regional jet market has really expanded compared to just, 10, 15 years ago. And if you looked at what the 4-engine options are, you kind of alluded to, these big 747 engines or 737 engines. But what people, fail to look at too, though, is your rudder has a vote. And when you start looking at 4 engines on the B-52 and then what the tail can do with the rudder is actually relatively small on the B-52.
Well, the vertical tail used to be a lot bigger way back when, right?
The tail's big, but the rudder on it for the size of the airplane is relatively small, and it's a single rudder. It's not a split rudder like you get with like a C-17
Gotcha.
or something like that. So the aero modeling that was going to have to take place as a result of that was almost pricing it. It was pricing it out of existence. So now we have these mature commercial jet engines that are regional jet engines that are far more fuel efficient. They're much smaller. And that's when we started, or the Air Force started looking at, well, can I pod these engines that have already thousands of hours of use on them in the commercial marketplace? Can we use one of those? And what's the viability of putting that on? Because there's less wind tunnel testing I have to do on the structure itself. I just really need to look at the inlets and the nacelle in terms of putting that on, because thrust was never a problem with the TF-33. You're very rarely taking off with full power with TF-33s. Everybody kind of takes a look at it and sees all the black smoke coming out of it. We actually have to look at our takeoff data and figure out like what the proper throttle setting is. It's not like a fighter where you're either putting in a nil or AB constantly. There's actually a percentage that you're calculating for your takeoff. So again, thrust is never the problem. What it comes down to is fuel efficiency and parts. So nobody builds engines like the TF-33 anymore. So the obsolescence of parts is a huge factor, because companies aren't going to make old school parts anymore. So therefore, it gets more and more expensive to find and buy parts. So the engines are unsustainable here in the next few years. And now I've got a tanker bill problem too, because in order for me to cross, the Pacific Ocean, I need 2 tankers, and I'm taking about 110,000 pounds of gas a tank. Now, what if I just need 1 tanker and then multiply that across the entire fleet? When I flew in Iraqi Freedom, we had 20 B-52s on night 1 alone. We were talking shock and awe. And then the next night, we generated like 8 more.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And then each B-52 that night from Diego to Iraq and back, we had 4 tankers giving us at least 110,000 pounds a shot. So it adds up. So what if I can have that, or at least make it
Real quick. I was picturing my mind of everything you just said about just the orders of magnitude of effort and just putting iron and fuel in the air. And the only thing I keep coming back to is America. America.
That day, like every single platform on Diego Garcia, minus 1 or 2, like left. Like the ramp was barren to make that mission happen. So pretty cool. But at the same time, like if I can get a 30% better fuel efficiency, what does that give back to Transcom to plan with, especially when you're talking about the Pacific and my fighter friends need gas to get there?
I've heard there's some issues. We have to dig into all the warts of the program, but you have a B-52 that was designed before computers, so on paper and a ruler and some pencil, pretty quickly. It's like a bar napkin. It actually evolved, I think, quite a few times before they actually, like the original concept didn't even have jet engines yet. So, but it is what it is, right? So, and it was over-engineered, which is why it's still flying around. It's awesome. You try to apply digital engineering processes into something that has a lot of variances. I think that's where some of the pilot integration problems are coming in. But you may not be seeing that in AFOTEC yet. I just see it in the programmatics and the news.
So the biggest problem right now, programmatically, we have going on, and then we're seeing in test, is the inlets themselves, from what we can tell, might be just a little too small. At higher angles of attack, there's some air intake distortion issues that we're seeing. So the intake is going to have to be redesigned. And the whole reason is like, well, you just said it was a commercial engine. It had all these hours on it. Why didn't you see this before? Well, that's true, but never did we ever pod two of them right next to one another.
Yeah.
So these are things in discovery that we're seeing. And again, works just fine when I'm flat, but when I'm starting to increase my AOA, that's when we're seeing these distortions.
That's actually, I think, a perfect example to justify the existence of the whole test program for initial operational test, is that 50 years ago, that would have never even been tested, and that B-52 would have been put in some kind of operational condition over enemy territory, and the pilot would have hit a certain angle of attack, stalled half the engines, and crashed. And then we're like, what happened? So just the fact that is being caught in tests means that the process works.
And it's pretty cool. And we were able to do this actually without even putting it on a B-52 yet. So this was a B-52 pod and nacelle that it's hanging in a structure in Stennis, Mississippi. And that's where they're running it. And this pod itself can actually manipulate the angle of attack on there.
Wow, that's cool.
If you Google it, you can actually see it. And that's where they first discovered, or I should say, we thought it was going to be a problem through the modeling, but that test validated that model that, yes, we're going to have to take a look at this. And unfortunately, we're going to have to modify it and redesign the inlet.
I think it's pretty cool that you can go, well, our modeling says this is going to be a problem, but like, it's not going to be too much effort to just validate the model's right. So even though it was caught as a bad thing, it actually validates the quality of the model, which is a good thing.
Correct. We're just scratching the surface for, the new engines aspect and the pod itself. When we compare what we're doing to the B-52 with R&P, so we kind of briefly just said, hey, like, we're going to put a new radar on it. It's going to go to a 4-person crew. We're going to kind of move the defensive station down to the offensive station. We are doing some modifications on the internal structure of the aircraft, but now when we step to something like re-engineering the B-52, that's where the extensiveness of the mod comes into play. It's more than just taking off the old engines and putting on the new engines. We have to run all new ducting. The engines themselves have new generators on it. So now you're talking a brand new power supply and the type of power that it's going to bring. You have to talk about how do we start these engines from an air start standpoint. So the TF-33s had the old school, we hooked an air cart to it and we started one engine using an air cart. We wanted to be the ability to kind of start like every modern jet now.
The JFS or something like that.
For an APU, there's considerable research to get that incorporated into the B-52.
Where are they going to put it?
So we're pretty sure it's going to go in the wings because we looked at putting it in the tail like a normal commercial jet has it.
Where the gunner was, right? That was going to be the APU.
But the B-52 is so long, the APUs don't have enough gusto, if you will.
Yeah.
Get the engines cranked from back there. That's what I'm told.
sounds right because that's a long way.
It's a long way. It's not like a commercial jetliner. We have a bomb bay in the middle. So
Yeah, so it's the B and B-52.
it's the B and
turns out.
B-52. It was designed to carry gas and bombs and not much room for much else. More importantly, for the nuclear mission, when the B-52s sit nuclear right now, we forego the air cart and we literally put this thing, it's about the size of a coffee can, into the engine. It's essentially gunpowder, right? Like it's
Oh, I forgot all about this. You have to like shoot something in the engine to start it. That's right.
you cart start the engine. As this thing is cooking off, it spools up enough gas to turn the turbine to give us enough oomph to spin all the engines, and each engine gets a cart. So you do you do an 8-cart start. Not to mention that the fumes coming out are not environmentally friendly to humans or the environment. So, and it's explosive.
Yeah, none of that sounds good.
And again, we go back to obsolescence of like they don't make explosive carts like this really anymore.
Yeah.
So we need the ability to self-start and self-start quickly in temperatures like you see in Minot, North Dakota.
Now, as a side benefit, some of the mock-ups I see is the pilots, the upstairs, get kind of a whole new glass cockpit because just out of necessity from the engines, right?
They do. We're entering the digital age. The old pointy needles that go up and down, those are going to be all gone, and that will be replaced with 2 large area displays. We're in negotiations right now, and what we want to display, our whole thing from a crew standpoint and with modern aircraft, with this, I say smart engine, you don't really need to, monitor gauges in 2024 for engine performance, right? Like the engines are smart enough that if they have a problem, they'll kind of give you a flag and let you know. So it's kind of like, hey, can we look at something else that's more mission beneficial while we're flying or while the pilots are flying, whether that be a targeting screen or a radar repeater. We got to fake all that in still, but like I shouldn't have to stare at digital versions of steam gauges in 2030.
This is going to sound a little disparaging for some of the audience, but you're going to have to dumb it down so that it's useful for like a fighter pilot. And I say that, half jokingly, because if all the fighter pilot did was monitor his engine performance of, say, like a single engine that he's flying with, he wouldn't actually be able to do his job, right? So all of that
100%.
stuff has all of these flags and automations and things. And so you know where the limits are. You can glance at it when you need to, every couple of minutes. And then if it doesn't tell you something's wrong, you can pretty much assure that nothing's wrong. So it's a mental shift, I think, going from not just the engine types and the display, but the human factors and culturally of like your cross check and everything. Like you have to trust the tech.
Yes.
It's just a different mentality.
Having the legacy that this aircraft has, that you mentioned, like it first flew on April 15th, 1952. That was the first day the YB-52 flew. And then we're into 2024, almost 2025 now. So I've met dudes whose grandfather flew the B-52 or a variant of the B-52. And to have that legacy is super awesome. Like even, like the passing of James Earl Jones resonated with the B-52 community because he played the radar navigator in the iconic movie Dr. Strangelove. So there's a lot of history with the B-52. At the same time, the mission set and how people operated the B-52 in the 50s and 60s, and even if we want to say Desert Storm, is dramatically different than how this aircraft is going to employ and how it should be viewed going into 2030. So this is when we start looking at, we've sustained the B-52 since its inception as an H model in 1960. We've done some minor improvements. But now that we're bringing on and modernizing the B-52 into the J model it has to be this complete paradigm shift into how we look at this airplane and what we want our crew members to do and how we want to employ the aircraft. The B-52 is going to be a standoff-only platform. Well, I've heard that probably 3 times in my 25-year career. And then every single time a conflict arises, we end up standing off for a while. And it, back in the day it was Calcum, and, now it's JASM. And then, who knows what's going to come next with hypersonics or whatever the next standoff weapon is. But at the end of the day, one of the power players on the battlefield is the B-52 or your bomber fleet as a whole. Like, I don't want to single out my B-1 and B-2 brethren. A bomber is a bomber. But at the end of the day, when you need massive amounts of firepower, overhead, dropping a lot of different ordnance and a lot of amounts of ordnance, like, the bomber always comes back into play. So that's where I think it's been a hurdle, right, to get that shift.
Story time for me, and I'll go back to you just a second. When I was at weapons school, I forgot we were towards the end of the phase. It was one of the integration phases, and we had a B-52 and a vol, and I was the mission commander, and we had to go take down some SAMs, go hit some targets, and we're like, all right, like, you do this, you do that, hit your targets, like, whatever you do, don't go west of this grid line because you will get shot down. Like, this is where we're not taking these SAMs out. We're going around them and under them, and we're going to hit these targets behind, and we're going to come back. So hit your targets. Do not go west of this line. It's like, yep. So we go out and we execute this vol, and what happens? I'm flying, and I see this B-52. Look down on my data, I'm like, where is that thing going? I see the tracks on my screen, and they had hit some secondary targets or something like that. I can't remember exactly why. And I remember, like, the debrief. It's like, hey, was it not clear what I told you to do? It's like, don't go west of that line. Yeah, you're gonna die. And I remember the other my fellow student was like, half of that's true. Like, you said if then. Like, well, I went back west of the line, but I didn't die. And I was like, yeah, you just got lucky. And the way that the range works, it's all like telemetry, and so you can actually pull up all the data.
Yeah.
And it was, sure enough, it was like the B-52 is like mezpenning with its electronic attack that it had back then. It was very effective against those particular type of threats. And I was just like, you won this one. Because I had this preconceived notion of like, no, you're just gonna die. You're just a big fat target flying around. I'm like, yeah,
sometimes
you actually
Leroy Jenkins works,
Yeah, you do have some game there. That was a long time ago, relatively long time ago. Not in the B-52 life of my life. So, yeah.
Everybody's like, oh, it's a standoff only. Well, and then bring the nuclear aspect into it, right? And then everything's off the table at that point. Like, we still have standoff nuclear weapons with the outcome, but the threats have evolved so much that, like, you're mezpenning or at least getting close to something scary, and it's nuclear warfare, so scariest environment imaginable is kind of
scariest environment. Just how you say it. Yeah,
that's how you gotta say it.
All right, we're getting short on time. Let's talk about. Compared to. The engine, the engine seems like just a wicked problem of a program. But so this should be relatively easy to put a new radio with an antenna. So let's talk about the AEHF.
The fact of the matter is we're back to the drawing board with it.
Oh, man.
We only have so many B-52s. You can only put so many B-52s into test because at the end of the day, there's still a U.S. STRATCOM mission that the B-52 has to fulfill every single day. Whether they're on alert or not, it doesn't matter. So you can't take half the fleet down to go do all these little custom mods that you want to do. The AEHF mod was actually turning into a monster. So the cool thing about AFOTEC is our guys in the program office kind of started seeing this trend, and we're signaling to Air Force Global Strike Command, and Air Force Global Strike Command saw it too. And they just said, you know what? We can't do a major modification like the way they wanted to. So we sent that back to the drawing board, and the proposals are actually going to start probably this winter.
Okay.
To see how we want to incorporate that into the jet.
The initial B-52J concept art, it had 2 humps on the wing spars on the top, and I was guessing that was supposed to be potentially where those antennas were going to be for SATCOM. But in that same picture, the front of the B-52 looks different. The nose, it removed those chins that used to be there for those pilot aids. So
Yeah.
So go ahead, tell me about that.
I'll go with the known, right? So the two pods, one was a low light camera, one was an infrared camera that used to get used a lot. And this is back again, when you say back in the day with B-52, when it used to do low level and terrain avoidance. So those pods are fly to fail. They're no longer being used. With SERP, those pods are going to be removed completely. So it'll be back to the nice smooth nose, almost reminiscent of a D model from Vietnam. It's actually kind of cool because as of right now, those chin pods are what restrict the B-52's top speed. Because of where they're located in air traveling through and speeding up as they go, So that's a big factor for the limiting airspeed. With the removal of those pods, theoretically, the B-52 will be able to go back to where it used to be of 0.91 Mach, which is kind of cool.
The buff it'll be less ugly, so lowercase u maybe. Let's get nice and slick.
So
I don't know.
we're already starting to get rid of some of the bumps and blisters that were on there before.
They can workshop that a little bit. Yeah, we'll figure out like buff with the lowercase u maybe.
She's getting a makeover, total
That's
makeover.
Right.
To go back to the first part of your question, there were a couple AEHF like kind of models that we saw. One was actually like this antenna that ran down the spine of the B-52, like from the back half. Those were the kind of mods that we were looking at. And we're like, we can't do that, just because of the amount of test and wind tunnels. I go back to that again. That would be needed to be used.
Yeah. All right, let's wrap this up. I told you a story about the B-52. You've got to have stories for days with 3,000 hours and a bunch of combat deployments. So tell me a story. Tell me a story about the B-52. And if it's a test-related story, that'd be even better. What do you got?
Ooh, okay. Yeah, like you said, test for days. One of the cool things I got to do in test is we took an aircraft out to Hawaii. And this kind of goes back to the Indo-Pacific problems, right? It was a hardship deployment. We had to spend an entire week at Hickam. But one of the munitions we were dropping was the new Quick Strike ER weapon.
Oh yeah.
This is a JDAM that has a wing kit on it, and essentially like you go plant a minefield from much further away, as opposed to doing in weapons school when I had to plan minefield drops at like 1,000 feet over the ocean and you're like in enemy harbors.
Most people listening would not know this, but it's like one of those tangent things in the writing with roles and missions.
Yeah.
The B-52, the Air Force, has an aerial mining mission for the Navy. So we have to provide aerial deployed mines into the ocean. And the B-52 is the platform that does that for the Air Force.
Yeah, using an old antiquated gravity bomb, like GP bomb system. So to kind of give us a little bit of standoff, we got to go to Hawaii and work with a P-8 and drop these mines, which was pretty cool. But not test related. But a cooler story, though, Paco, is where I got to be one of the first people to drop the CV-105, the centrifuge weapon, in Anger.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool. So we checked in. This is like probably in the middle of Iraq. We'd already been in Iraq for about 2 weeks. So we show up with a full load of CV-105s, which for us it's 16. We get a troops in contact call, and we're like, hey, like, come check in. And the ground forces were actually under pretty significant fire. The enemy forces were actually using AAA pieces as direct fire weapons.
Oh, wow.
On the troops. So they needed help in a big way. So when we checked on the JTAC, you could hear the gunfire. And we're like, okay. And luckily, the Wizzo sitting to my left, I think I was a second lieutenant still, was a weapons school graduate. And he's like, hey, we've got it. And we plotted out how we wanted these weapons oriented. And with the size of the target area, we were kind of like, I think we need to use all of these. And the JTAC was
The
like,
answer's yes.
yes. And the JTAC, pretty much he goes, I don't care, drop all of them. And we didn't know what like effects were going to, because it was a new weapon. It got dropped in combat an hour before like we showed up. So that was the official first use of it, right? So we're like, okay, like, here we go. We go out to make our run, and a couple Strike Eagle brethren check in. Hey, like, Strike Eagle is checking in, we can help. And the AWACS was basically like, negative, B-52 strike inbound, and cleared this swath of airspace so that we could come in. So we come in, we get rid of all 16 of these things. They do their 7 consecutive miracles of death. And when we check back in, it was like, there was no more gunfire in the background. And the JTAC was like, basically like, you killed everyone. These things worked as advertised. They took out every vehicle, any piece of artillery that was hot. It decimated that whole thing and basically turned that whole tide of the battle. So that was pretty cool.
That is a fantastic story. We'll put a video, the kind of voiceover we're talking about. So this is a canister that opens up and it throws these the skeets out.
Yeah,
Pucks, the skeets, and then the skeets spin and throws the pucks, and then the pucks go up and the parachutes come out. They're EFPs, so they're armor piercing slugs. So you drop 16 canisters. That's something like, I don't know, a couple hundred effectors. I don't know.
That's where it goes into like, there's 4 canisters and each canister has 4 pucks. It was, and then like,
we're both weapons school graduates.
Yeah.
We should know this, but I lost that penguin off my iceberg a long time ago. Whoever designed that weapon, good on them.
America.
That is a fantastic story. All right. Well, in the time we have left, I do have one reattack.
Okay.
With all of the money, so like $45 billion going into modernize the B-52, all of the upgrades that we talked about today.
Yeah.
Is it still going to need a parachute to stop when it lands?
Unfortunately, yes. So actually here at Edwards right now, we did new brakes testing.
Hey.
But they're form fit replacement for materials. We're still crunching the data, but the intent was to never get rid of the parachute. I don't know, though. Maybe the numbers will show that we don't need it anymore. But it's still, it's iconic, right? You can't get rid of it.
Some things never change.
Some things never change.
Well, Little Joe, thanks for the conversation. I learned a lot today. I really enjoyed it. I think the audience is going to too. For the audience, if you've enjoyed this, like, follow, and subscribe. And tell your friends about the newsletter. That's where all the good stuff is. And in the meantime, how can the audience keep tabs on what is going on with AFOTEC and the B-52? Where do we find you?
Definitely our LinkedIn profile is probably our most followed. There is AFOTEC headquarters, and then underneath that, we actually have our own LinkedIn profile of Det5.
Awesome. We will put a link in the show notes then. All right. Well, that's the show. See ya.
See ya. Thanks, Paco.